August 1948. Shanghai is hot, wet, and afraid. The line is not loud. That is what makes it worse. No shouting, no protest. Just the slow movement of families carrying the condensed history of their lives in small packages that fit inside a coat, a cloth pouch, a wooden box, a wedding bracelet. A few silver dollars, a thin stack of US notes hidden for emergencies, a gold bar wrapped in old fabric and stitched into the lining of a jacket years earlier when the first paper promises began to rot. Now those objects are being brought back into the open. At the counter, the state offers a new beginning, a new currency. The Gold Yuan, announced on August 19, 1948. It was presented as a reset, old notes out, stability in, prices frozen, confidence restored. One new unit for 3 million of the old national currency, 4 to the US dollar, a clean number, a disciplined promise, a final chance to believe that authority still had a plan. But the real message was not monetary, it was political. Private gold, silver, and foreign exchange were no longer simply savings. They had become evidence of disobedience. The government ordered citizens to surrender hard assets and register foreign exchange under emergency controls. In Shanghai, Chiang Ching-kuo was sent in to enforce the campaign with the atmosphere of a purge, not a reform. This was the moment when private wealth stopped being private in any meaningful sense. And that is the scene to hold in your mind. Not a chart, not a theory, a line. Because this is how great confiscations usually begin. Not with mobs in the street, but with ordinary, law-abiding people trying to stay safe. They comply because the penalty for refusal feels immediate, while the risk inside the official promise still feels abstract. So ask the question the people in that line had to answer without saying it aloud. If the state threatened you with prison, ruin, or worse, would you hand over your life savings to receive the paper it had just printed? For a brief moment, the policy worked at least on the surface. Shops reopened with posted prices that no longer changed by the hour. The chaos of the previous currency, the Fabi, seemed contained. The government declared strict price controls. Speculation was criminalized. Hoarding was treated as sabotage. There were arrests, public punishments, and visible enforcement designed to send a message. Stability had returned, and this time it would be enforced, not negotiated. For the urban middle-class shopkeepers, clerks, teachers, small isng mill, mun comments, onos, this mattered. They did not need perfection. They needed predictability. The memory of hyperinflation had already hollowed out trust, but it had not yet destroyed the instinct to comply. Many believed that this reform was different because it came with force. That was the psychological pivot. Previous currencies failed because they were mismanaged. This one, people told themselves, would succeed because it would be controlled, and control, in desperate systems, often feels like competence. The gold yuan was presented as limited in supply, anchored by surrendered gold and foreign exchange and backed by the authority of a government that was finally willing to impose discipline. For a population exhausted by instability, this combination scarcity, backing, enforcement created something close to belief. But belief was not evenly distributed. Rural populations, informal traders, and those who had already been burned multiple times showed more hesitation. They had learned a quieter lesson. When a state suddenly demands your hard assets in exchange for its paper, the timing is rarely accidental. Still, open refusal was not a realistic option for most. This is where the system tightened. Price controls created the illusion of stability, but they also created shortages. Goods did not disappear immediately. They withdrew. Sellers held back inventory. Transactions moved off the books. A dual economy began to form. One official, compliant, and increasingly empty. The other informal, illegal, and still functioning. At the same time, enforcement escalated. In cities like Shanghai, inspections became routine. Businesses were monitored. Inventories were checked. Anyone suspected of withholding goods or bypassing the new currency faced punishment. The goal was not just economic stabilization. It was behavioral alignment. And for a short window, it appeared to work. The line shortened. The new notes circulated. Prices held on paper. But underneath, something more fragile was forming. Because the entire structure depended on one condition, that the government would restrain itself. And that was the one variable it did not control. So the real question was never whether citizens would comply. It was whether the issuer would. The promise of restraint did not survive the month. The gold yuan was introduced with a strict issuance cap. 2 billion yuan. That number was not arbitrary. It was the foundation of the entire system. Citizens surrender gold, silver, and foreign exchange under the assumption that supply would remain limited. Scarcity was the only thing giving the new paper credibility. Remove that, and the structure had nothing left. Within weeks, the cap was quietly abandoned. There was no formal admission in the streets, no public reversal framed as a failure. The shift happened the way it usually does in late-stage systems, through necessity first, explanation later. The government was running out of options, and the civil war against the Chinese Communist forces was accelerating into its most expensive phase. War does not wait for monetary discipline. Military payrolls had to be met. Supplies had to be purchased. Transport had to be maintained, and tax collection in a collapsing economy could not keep pace with expenditure. That gap, the distance between what the state needed and what it could actually extract through normal means, became the printing press. At first, the expansion was rationalized, temporary, controlled, necessary to preserve the nation, the same language that has accompanied nearly every monetary breach in history. But the arithmetic of crisis is unforgiving. Once the cap was broken, the constraint was gone, and without constraint, issuance follows pressure. Pressure, in 1948 China, was relentless. New notes entered circulation faster than goods could return to the shelves. The price controls that had created the illusion of stability now began to fracture under the weight of reality. Sellers who had complied initially could no longer restock at controlled prices. Losses accumulated. Inventory disappeared. So the system adapted in the only way it could. The official economy froze. The unofficial one expanded. Goods reappeared, but not at state prices and not always in gold yuan. Barter returned. Foreign currencies resurfaced in backroom transactions. Silver coins, which had supposedly been eliminated from circulation, began to trade again at a premium. The very assets the state had tried to absorb were quietly re-emerging as parallel money, and this is where the fracture became visible to ordinary people. A schoolteacher paid in gold yuan could still buy rice, just not at the official price and not in the official market. A shopkeeper could still sell goods, just not within the legal framework that had been imposed weeks earlier. The distance between legal money and usable money widened by the day. Then came the acceleration. By late 1948, issuance was no longer even pretending to be controlled. The supply of gold yuan expanded at a rate that made the original cap meaningless. What had been presented as a disciplined reset turned into a flood. Within less than a year, the currency would lose virtually all purchasing power. The number is difficult to process, but it matters. The money supply expanded approximately 565,000-fold in about 10 months. That is not inflation as a trend. That is collapse as a function. At that speed, prices do not rise, they detach. Wages cannot adjust. Contracts become irrelevant. Savings evaporate not over years, but between pay cycles. The concept of planning next month, next quarter disappears entirely. And this is the moment the line from Part 1 becomes clear. The confiscation was not completed when citizens handed over their gold. It was completed when the paper they received could no longer buy anything real. Because at that point, the exchange had been finalized. Hard assets moved to the state. Worthless liabilities remained with the public. Once the printing crossed a certain threshold, the system stopped behaving like an economy. It became a battlefield of time, not ideology, not policy. Time. How fast could you spend your wages before they lost value? How quickly could a merchant replace inventory before replacement costs doubled? How long could a household wait before converting paper into anything real? In Shanghai and other major cities, the rhythm of daily life changed first. Paydays stopped being monthly anchors. They became moments of urgency. Workers were paid and immediately rushed into the streets, not to shop, but to escape the currency. Rice, cooking oil, cloth, coal, anything that could hold value for even a few days became preferable to holding cash overnight. Queues formed again, but they were different now. Not surrender lines, escape lines. A clerk who waited even 48 hours can find that his entire wage packet no longer covered what it had 2 days earlier. A factory owner faced a more complex trap: sell goods for gold yuan and risk being unable to restock, or hold inventory and be accused of hoarding. Either choice carried loss. Only the form of loss differed. Price controls, still officially in place, turned from stabilizers into distortions. On paper, prices remained fixed. In reality, goods vanished. The official shop windows displayed numbers that no longer corresponded to actual transactions. Behind those windows, in alleys and private rooms, real prices were negotiated in whispers, often in silver or foreign currency. The legal economy became theater. The real economy went underground. And as this divide widened, enforcement did not relax, it intensified. The state's response to shortages was not to acknowledge the failure of controls, but to double down on them. Inspections increased. Penalties escalated. Accusations of economic sabotage became more common. In some cases, punishments were public, designed to restore fear where trust had already disappeared. But fear cannot restore purchasing power. It can only force participation in a system that no longer works. This is where the human fracture becomes visible. A school teacher paid on time, compliant, fully within the law found that her salary could no longer reliably feed her family. Not because she had made a bad decision, but because the unit she was paid in had detached from reality. A trader operating illegally, accepting silver or foreign notes, could still function. Legality and survival had diverged. And once that divergence becomes clear, behavior changes permanently. People begin to optimize for outcomes, not rules. Gold and silver, supposedly removed from circulation months earlier, returned in small, quiet ways. Jewelry was broken apart and traded by weight. Foreign banknotes circulated discreetly. Barter networks expanded, not as a lifestyle choice, but as a necessity. The state had succeeded in one objective. It had absorbed a large share of private hard assets during the initial phase, but it had failed in the one area that determines whether a currency lives or dies: credibility. Without credibility, enforcement becomes more aggressive, not less. Because the system can no longer rely on voluntary participation, it must manufacture compliance. And this is the pattern that matters. First, stabilize through force. Then, break the constraint. Then, print to cover the gap. Then, criminalize the exits. By the time the average citizen recognizes the full sequence, the window for safe exit is already narrow or closed. What remains is adaptation under pressure. And that is where the real divide emerges, not between rich and poor, but between those who understood the mechanism early and those who trusted the promise just a little too long. By the time the collapse was undeniable, the rules had already changed. Not officially, the system was still intact. The currency still existed. Prices were still posted. Laws were still enforced. But functionally, something more important had happened. Exit had been redefined as crime. This is the stage most people misunderstand when they study monetary collapse from a distance. They focus on inflation rates, exchange values, policy errors. But inside the event, the defining pressure is not price, it is restriction. In late 1948, moving wealth outside the system was no longer a neutral financial decision. It was treated as disloyalty, hoarding hard assets, trading in alternative currencies, bypassing official markets. These were not just economic acts, they were prosecutable. And that changed who survived. Because survival was no longer about being correct. It was about being early and quiet. Some households made a decision that, at the time, looked irrational, even dangerous. They did not fully comply. They surrendered part of their holdings to satisfy inspections, but concealed the rest. Gold coins buried beneath floorboards, silver sewn into clothing. Foreign notes split across family members and moved incrementally rather than all at once. Others took a different path. They converted wealth into mobility. Jewelry that could be carried across checkpoints. Compact stores of value that did not require explanation. Connections outside the immediate jurisdiction, relatives, trade partners, or simply access to another city where enforcement lagged slightly behind. None of this was safe. There are documented cases of confiscation, imprisonment, and worse for those caught bypassing controls. The risk was real, immediate, and visible. That is what made compliance so powerful. It was the lower risk decision in the short term, but only in the short term. Because those who fully complied faced a different kind of certainty. Their wealth had already been converted into a unit that was now collapsing beyond recovery. They were exposed completely to the system's failure, with no remaining buffer. This is the uncomfortable divide the event reveals. The most law-abiding citizens often absorbed the largest losses, not because they made poor decisions, but because they trusted the structure they were operating within. They believed that compliance would be reciprocated with stability. It wasn't. And this is where the pattern extends beyond 1948. Modern financial systems rarely demand gold at gunpoint. They do something quieter. They track, restrict, nudge, and gradually remove the friction from compliance while increasing the friction of exit. Capital controls, transaction monitoring, withdrawal limits, forced conversions under emergency frameworks. These are not identical to 1948, but they rhyme. The mechanism is the same at its core. First, concentrate visibility. then restrict alternatives, then make staying easy and leaving difficult. By the time the average participant feels the pressure, the system has already mapped their options and limited them. What survived 1948 was not a currency. It was behavior, not perfectly, not cleanly, but consistently enough that the pattern can be studied without speculation. Those who preserved purchasing power did three things, often imperfectly, often at risk, but early enough to matter. They refused full conversion. They maintained at least some exposure to assets that did not depend on a single issuer's promise metal, foreign currency goods with immediate utility. Not because these were ideal, but because they were independent. They prioritized optionality over legality when the two diverged. And they understood something that only becomes obvious in hindsight. Jurisdiction is a financial variable, where your wealth exists, and under which authority determines whether it remains yours when rules change quickly. None of this made them immune. Many still lost heavily. Some were caught. Some misjudged timing. There is no clean escape inside a collapsing system. But there is a difference between partial loss and total absorption. That difference is where survival lives. Now bring the pattern forward carefully. Today's systems are more sophisticated, more digitized, more observable. Enforcement does not need to be visible to be effective. Restrictions can be applied silently through limits, delays, permissions, compliance layers that feel administrative rather than coercive. The mechanism does not announce itself. It accumulates. And then, under stress, it activates. So the lesson is not to predict a repeat of 1948. It is to recognize the sequence. Forced conversion, explicit or indirect. Constraint, declared or implied. Expansion beyond the constraint. Restriction of exit. Once that sequence is in motion, the outcome is no longer theoretical. It is procedural, and it leaves you with a narrow choice. Either you treat official assurances as sufficient and accept the system's terms as they evolve, or you treat history as evidence and build just enough distance between your survival and any single promise that can be changed without your consent. There is no third position once the line begins to form.